I never imagined my life would change the day I met him. The air in the room smelled faintly of expensive cologne, a mix of cedarwood and something sharp, the kind of scent that makes people notice you without even trying. And there he was, Victor Larrivee, a man who owned skyscrapers, yachts, and a reputation for turning the lives of women into his personal entertainment. I wasn't supposed to be noticed. I was, by his standards, the wrong type, overweight, average-looking in his glittering social world, too outspoken, too unapologetic about the curves that society whispered I should hide. But Victor saw me, or, rather, he saw me as a challenge, a bet. "You really think she'll go for it?" his friend had whispered across the table, the smirk on Victor's face catching the corner of my attention. Victor's eyes met mine, and in that moment, I felt it, the kind of gaze that tries to measure you, size you up, and decide if you're worth the trouble. And in his case, I wasn't, not really. I was supposed to be a game, a distraction, someone to amuse him until the next socialite caught his attention. But Victor had no idea who he had chosen. I was tired of being underestimated, tired of the whispers, the judgments, the invisible walls that society built around women like me. And yet, I also understood something very few people did. Power doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes, it wears the skin of someone the world has written off. The first time we spent a day together was a calculated risk. He wanted to flaunt me at a gala, the cameras, the flashing lights, the inevitable social scrutiny. I went because I had no other choice. Exposure was power if wielded correctly, and I had learned the rules of this dangerous game long before Victor ever stepped into my life. From the start, I noticed the small things, the way he underestimated my intelligence, the way he laughed when I made a pointed observation that clearly hit closer to the truth than he expected. The more he tried to control the situation, the more I realized that his game could be flipped, and I intended to flip it. I wasn't just a woman in his gamble. I was a storm he hadn't prepared for. Every word I spoke, every confident step I took in that glittering ballroom, started to unravel the invisible control he thought he had. His eyes narrowed once or twice, a flicker of something dangerous, irritation, perhaps fear, perhaps curiosity. All I knew was that I had his attention. And unlike every other woman he had toyed with, I wasn't going to play by his rules. That night, as the city glittered under millions of lights outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, I made a silent vow. Victor Larrivee had chosen me as a bet, but bets have consequences, and I was about to show him just how unpredictable the stakes could be. This was the beginning, the first hour, the first spark in a battle that neither of us fully understood yet. And as I left the gala, the sound of his name whispered behind me like a challenge, I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't just going to win this game. I was going to change it. The next morning, Victor sent a message. Simple, almost casual: breakfast at the penthouse. I knew what it meant. This was not just a social invitation, it was a test. A chance to see if I would play along, allow myself to be controlled, or, as I intended, turn the table. When I arrived, the penthouse was a world of glass, steel, and luxury that seemed almost unreal. The city spread beneath us like a glittering chessboard, and I realized immediately, Victor viewed life as a game, and he believed he was always 3 moves ahead. But I had learned to read people, the quiet observations, the micro-expressions, the subtle overconfidence that betrayed true weakness. Victor thought his money, charm, and social power could dictate the rules. What he didn't understand was that I had my own strategy. "Good morning," he said, voice smooth, casual, as if nothing significant had happened the night before. His smile was deliberate, calculated. "Good morning," I replied evenly, matching his calm with my own composure. I didn't let the awe of the penthouse or his reputation intimidate me. I had long since mastered the art of holding my own in spaces where I was out of place. He gestured toward the breakfast table, a spread of delicacies, expensive coffee, and fruit I pretended to nibble at but barely touched. "You don't eat much," he noted, as if commenting on me was part of some social sport. "I eat what I need," I said lightly, meeting his gaze. A small spark of surprise flickered across his face. Most women in his world flattered him, played along, or ignored his subtle insults. I did neither. I reminded him that I was not a player piece in his game. Victor laughed softly, leaning back. "You're different." I smiled inwardly. Different. That was a compliment in disguise, one he didn't realize would be his undoing. Being underestimated was my greatest weapon. He thought his money and influence could buy compliance, charm, and fear. He had never encountered someone who was quietly untouchable because she understood her own value. The breakfast conversation was a dance, each of us testing boundaries. Victor asked questions, probing for weaknesses. I answered carefully, revealing enough to engage him, but never revealing the full extent of my knowledge, my intelligence, or my plans. Each reply, each glance, each pause was calculated to unsettle him just enough to see cracks in his armor. By the time the coffee was finished, I realized something crucial: Victor had never met anyone like me. He thought he had picked me as a bet, someone to amuse himself with. But the woman in front of him was not a bet. I was a challenge, a puzzle, and a storm waiting to unfold. Later that week, he invited me to a private gala, a place where he could flaunt his wealth and possess my presence. I agreed, knowing that appearances mattered, but I had my own plan. I would attend, but I would not be the passive figure he expected. Every interaction, every smile, every word would quietly chip away at the pedestal he had built around himself. And that night, under chandeliers and the gaze of the elite, Victor realized, too late, that this game was no longer in his control. I smiled, danced, laughed, and charmed not to please him, but to command the room. People noticed me, not because he brought me, but because I owned my presence. Every time he tried to assert dominance, I subtly shifted the conversation, redirected attention, and exposed vulnerabilities he had thought hidden. By the end of the evening, I knew one thing: Victor Larrivee had underestimated me, and that mistake would cost him more than he could imagine. He had chosen me as a bet, but I was already changing the rules, proving that wealth, influence, and arrogance were no match for strategy, self-respect, and raw intelligence. As I left the gala, the city lights reflected in my eyes. Victor would try again, surely, and each move would be more dangerous, more calculated. But I had made my first strike, and the game had begun. The woman he thought he could control had already won the first battle, the battle of respect, perception, and power. And this was only the beginning. The weeks that followed were a game of observation, patience, and subtle manipulation. Victor Larrivee, the man who had once seen me as nothing more than a gamble, began to realize that I was unpredictable. His wealth, influence, and charm could not control me, and that unnerved him in ways no one had ever done before. He tried to provoke me, testing boundaries with offhand comments and subtle challenges. "You really think you belong in this world?" he asked one evening, during a private dinner at his penthouse. The city sprawled beneath us like a glittering chessboard, a visual metaphor of the power he wielded, and the battlefield I had entered. "I don't belong," I said calmly, meeting his gaze. "I belong where I choose to be." Victor raised an eyebrow, a flicker of something I hadn't expected: respect, or perhaps fear. The kind of fear that comes not from physical threat, but from knowing that someone might outsmart you at every turn. He tried to lure me into his world, offering gifts, exclusive events, invitations to private yachts and elite circles. Each offer was a test: would I accept his control, or would I remain autonomous? I smiled politely, declining most, but strategically attending some. Every appearance was carefully calculated to show him that I could play the social game, but on my terms. And slowly, the tides began to shift. Victor's friends began to notice it too. The woman he had chosen as a joke now commanded attention wherever she went. He had tried to bet on my insecurity, assuming I would shrink under scrutiny. Instead, I shone. I learned to walk into a room and make heads turn, not with designer clothes or perfect hair, but with confidence, intelligence, and the subtle art of self-possession. Then came the night that changed everything. Victor had organized an extravagant charity gala, expecting me to be the accessory, the social novelty to impress his peers. The lights were bright, the music grand, the champagne flowing endlessly. He approached me, smiling with that arrogant air of entitlement. "You'll need to follow my lead tonight," he said. "I can't have you embarrassing me." I laughed softly, almost to myself. "Follow your lead? No, Victor. Tonight, we'll see who leads whom." The gala became a battlefield. Every interaction was a duel of wit and presence. Victor tried to orchestrate the crowd, positioning me for maximum attention to assert control. But I turned his plans on their head. I charmed powerful businessmen and influential women, spoke intelligently on topics he had assumed I knew nothing about, and handled the subtle social politics of the room with ease. People noticed. Whispers followed me like shadows. Victor's confidence faltered, visible only in the smallest micro-expressions: the tightening of his jaw, the subtle narrowing of his eyes. He had chosen me as a gamble, a bet he believed he could win with money and charm. Instead, he had met his match. By the end of the night, Victor was no longer the dominant force in the room. I had claimed the space, commanded attention, and, most importantly, shown him that I was not to be underestimated. Later, when we were alone on the balcony overlooking the city, Victor's tone was different, quieter, almost reflective. "I didn't think you'd do that," he admitted. "I never play by other people's rules," I said, the wind brushing through my hair. You picked me as a bet, Victor, but I've already changed the game. For the first time, I saw vulnerability in him, not weakness in the conventional sense, but the realization that he couldn't control everything. That revelation gave me power, but also a dangerous understanding. Victor was not a man to take lightly. He would adapt, escalate, and try again. And I was ready. The following days were a delicate dance. Texts, invitations, subtle tests, and veiled challenges filled our interactions. He tried to assert dominance, I countered with poise. He attempted charm, I responded with intelligence. Every encounter was a game of strategy, attraction, and subtle manipulation, and the stakes were higher than ever. Yet, amidst the tension, something unexpected began to emerge: mutual respect. Victor started to acknowledge my mind, my confidence, and my unshakable self-worth. For a man accustomed to winning with ease, this recognition was unfamiliar and dangerous for him. I realized then that I had moved from being a mere bet to a formidable opponent. And in that dynamic, I held the advantage. I had nothing to lose, and everything to gain. The stage was set for the ultimate confrontation, a battle of minds, strategy, and influence that would determine not just who held power, but who truly understood control, respect, and the unpredictable force of a woman underestimated by the world. This was no longer just a game. It was a revolution, and I intended to win. The days that followed the gala were a whirlwind. Victor Larrivee, the man who had once seen me as a gamble, now treated me with a mixture of intrigue, frustration, and, I could sense it, respect. But respect in his world was dangerous. He was a man accustomed to control, and when control slipped through his fingers, he became unpredictable. He began to escalate. Invitations became more exclusive, events more public, and the stakes higher. Every appearance, every gesture, every word was a test, not just of me, but of my confidence, my intelligence, my ability to navigate his dangerous, glittering world. Victor had underestimated me, yes, but now he was learning, slowly, sometimes grudgingly, that I was not just a woman to be paraded for entertainment. I was a force, one he could not predict, manipulate, or control easily. The turning point came unexpectedly. One evening, he invited me to his private yacht for a weekend getaway, a show of wealth, power, and the kind of intimacy he assumed could bend me to his will. The ocean stretched endlessly beyond the deck, moonlight glinting off the water, reflecting the glittering city skyline in the distance. "I want to see how far you'll go," he said quietly as we stood alone on the deck. "Do you really have what it takes to survive in my world?" I looked at him, meeting his gaze. Calm, composed, unshaken. "I don't survive your world, Victor," I said. "I change it." That night, the tension between us escalated. Every conversation was a subtle battle, every glance a challenge. He tried to provoke, to charm, to intimidate. I responded with poise, wit, and a careful strategy that allowed him to think he was in control, while I quietly maneuvered the game in my favor. Then came the first major test, a business dinner with his associates. Victor assumed I would be a quiet accessory, a charming distraction while he handled negotiations. But I had prepared. Every detail, every piece of knowledge, every insight had been researched. I contributed ideas, challenged assumptions, and even subtly guided the conversation in ways that made the group reconsider their positions. The room fell silent at first, then murmurs of admiration spread. Victor's associates began to realize that the woman he had chosen as a bet was no ordinary guest. She was sharp, confident, and commanding respect in a way that no one in his world had expected. Victor watched me, a mixture of astonishment and frustration in his eyes. "You're dangerous," he said softly later, as we left the dinner. "I'm aware," I replied, smiling. "But it's not a game to me, it's life." For the first time, I saw a crack in his armor, the acknowledgement that he could not control me completely. And that crack gave me leverage. Victor had always been a man who believed he could dominate through wealth, charm, and social power. Now, he realized that intellect, courage, and self-assurance were forces he had underestimated. The following weeks became a series of strategic encounters. Each dinner, gala, and private event was a new battlefield. Victor tried subtle manipulations, and I countered with intelligence and confidence. His attempts at seduction were met with sharp wit and unflinching self-possession. Slowly, the man who had chosen me as a gamble began to respect me and fear me in ways he could never admit publicly. Then came the true turning point, a private conversation late one night, high above the city skyline, the lights twinkling below like distant stars. Victor's voice was low, almost vulnerable. "You're unlike anyone I've ever met," he admitted. "I don't know if I want to win or lose." I stepped closer, maintaining eye contact. "Then stop seeing me as a bet," I said. See me as the person I am, and maybe you'll learn what it really means to be challenged. That night, a silent understanding passed between us. He would no longer underestimate me, and I would no longer pretend to be controlled. The game had changed. What began as a wager, a social amusement, had transformed into a dangerous, intoxicating battle of minds, strategy, and hearts. The stakes were higher than ever. Victor's pride, power, and control collided with my intelligence, courage, and independence. Every interaction carried tension, every glance hinted at unspoken truths, and every choice shaped the outcome of a game neither of us fully understood yet. I had learned something vital: the greatest victories are not won through money or influence, but through presence, intellect, and the refusal to be underestimated. And Victor Larrivee, the man who had once thought he could gamble with me, would soon discover that I was a storm he could neither predict nor contain. The first half of the game had been mine. Now, the true challenge awaited, a confrontation that would test everything: pride, power, attraction, and ultimately, who would emerge as the victor in this battle of wills. And I was ready. Weeks had passed since that night on the penthouse balcony, and the game between Victor and me had evolved into something far more intense than either of us had anticipated. What started as a bet had transformed into a battlefield, one of wits, power, and unspoken attraction, each move fraught with danger and unpredictability. Victor had escalated his tactics. He sent invitations to exclusive events, each more extravagant than the last, testing not only my loyalty but my patience and composure. He flaunted wealth, influence, and charm like weapons, assuming I would falter under the pressure. But I had learned that real power lies not in grandeur or intimidation, but in presence, intelligence, and control over one's own choices. The breaking point came during an elite art gala, held in a historic mansion that seemed more like a fortress than a venue. Victor had expected me to follow, to blend into the background, and to serve as the living trophy of his success. But I refused. I arrived wearing confidence instead of an accessory's role, commanding attention with every step. The crowd noticed immediately. Murmurs spread. The woman Victor Larrivee had chosen was no longer a mere spectacle. She engaged influential collectors with sharp insight, challenged assumptions with subtle intelligence, and handled delicate social dynamics with precision. Victor, for the first time in his life, saw a woman not only meet him on equal footing but surpass him in the arena he thought he owned. "You're impossible," he whispered when I passed by, a half-smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I prefer unstoppable," I replied, letting the words hang like a silent challenge. The night escalated further when an unexpected scandal erupted, a rival socialite attempting to undermine Victor in front of the city's elite. Instinctively, I intervened, neutralizing the situation with tact, poise, and undeniable authority. The crowd watched in awe as I subtly maneuvered the event back under control. Victor's influence had been shaken, but mine had grown exponentially in one night. After the gala, we found ourselves alone on the mansion terrace. The city lights stretched endlessly below, reflecting the intensity of the night. Victor's usual arrogance was replaced with a rare vulnerability, a recognition that the woman he had dismissed was a force he could not easily contain. "You keep surprising me," he admitted quietly, voice tinged with frustration and fascination. "I don't know if I want to win or lose with you." I smiled faintly. "Then perhaps stop seeing me as a challenge to be conquered. See me as someone who doesn't play by your rules, and maybe you'll understand what true unpredictability looks like." Victor's jaw tightened, a flicker of frustration and desire intertwining in a way that was magnetic yet dangerous. Our dynamic had changed, no longer a simple game of wager and entertainment, it had become a delicate balance of attraction, rivalry, and mutual respect. The next week, Victor escalated again, this time through strategy and manipulation. He arranged private meetings, offered high-stakes collaborations, and tested my patience with subtle provocations. Each interaction was a duel. He tried to bend me with charm and power, I countered with intellect, calm, and unwavering self-assurance. One evening, during a lavish dinner overlooking the city skyline, Victor leaned closer, voice low and dangerous. "You think you're in control," he said, "but everyone has a breaking point." I met his gaze, unflinching. "Everyone has limits. But unlike you, Victor, I choose where mine lie, and they aren't dictated by money, influence, or fear." He chuckled, almost reluctantly impressed. "You really are something else." "And you," I replied, "are finally learning that choosing a bet doesn't mean controlling it." That night, as the city shimmered below, I realized the truth. Victor had not anticipated me, not my intelligence, my strategy, or my ability to turn his world upside down. He had underestimated me in every way, and that underestimation had become my greatest weapon. By the end of the week, it was undeniable, the game had shifted. Victor Larrivee, the man who had once believed he could gamble with my presence, was now navigating a new reality, one where he was challenged, intrigued, and, more dangerously for him, attracted. And I had only just begun, because while he thought he could control the outcome, I knew this game had no rules that favored him. He had chosen a bet, but I was already rewriting the terms. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not only determine the balance of power between us but reveal who could truly command influence, respect, and desire in a world built on wealth, arrogance, and appearances. This was no longer about a bet. This was about survival, dominance, and ultimately, proving that underestimating me was the gravest mistake Victor Larrivee could ever make. The fire had been lit, and neither of us would emerge from it unchanged. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of strategy, subtle provocations, and unspoken tension. Victor had begun to realize, fully and uncomfortably, that I was not a wager he could predict. Every time he tried to assert dominance, I countered with intelligence, poise, and an unwavering sense of self. It wasn't just a game anymore, it had become a storm he couldn't control. He invited me to a private weekend retreat at his mountain villa, far from the city lights, cameras, and public scrutiny. The villa was a fortress of elegance, with glass walls overlooking the misty peaks and forests below. Victor assumed that isolation would give him an advantage, that the walls and luxury would allow him to dominate me without interference. But I had my own plan. From the moment I arrived, the retreat became a battlefield of wits. Every conversation, every movement, was calculated. Victor's charm was on full display, his confidence almost tangible. He tried to unsettle me with subtle criticisms disguised as flirtation, testing my patience, my ego, and my boundaries. "You're clever, I'll give you that," he said one evening as we watched the sunset paint the mountains in gold and crimson. "But do you really think you can outmaneuver me?" I met his gaze, calm yet fiery. "I don't think, Victor. I know, and you're about to find out." The night escalated with games of strategy disguised as casual conversation. Victor attempted to manipulate, to provoke, to charm, yet I remained untouchable. He underestimated my ability to read people, my attention to detail, and my patience. Each small victory, a clever answer, a subtle maneuver, a social interaction where I took control, chipped away at his arrogance and shifted the balance of power. But the real turning point came during a stormy night. The wind howled against the villa, lightning illuminating the jagged peaks outside. Victor and I found ourselves alone in the library, the air electric with tension. For the first time, he dropped his mask of superiority and admitted something he hadn't before: vulnerability. "You're unlike anyone I've ever met," he whispered, voice low, almost breaking. "I don't know if I want to win or surrender." I stepped closer, feeling the pulse of danger and desire intertwine. "Then stop seeing this as a game," I said. "This isn't about winning or losing. It's about who we really are and who we're willing to become." For the first time, Victor hesitated. The man who had once believed himself untouchable, who had treated women like pawns in a game of amusement and power, was now navigating a new reality. He was challenged, intrigued, and for the first time, vulnerable. The storm outside mirrored the storm between us, unpredictable, intense, and unavoidable. Neither of us could retreat, and in that intensity, a strange, dangerous respect grew. Victor had chosen me as a bet, assuming control, but he now realized that control was impossible. I was autonomous, unpredictable, and unstoppable. The next day brought new challenges. Victor's business associates arrived unexpectedly for an impromptu meeting, and he tried to reassert his dominance in front of them. But I had anticipated it. I spoke with confidence, offered insights, and subtly guided the conversation. Victor's colleagues were impressed, whispering to each other about the sharpness and poise of the woman he had once underestimated. Victor watched, his expression a mixture of frustration, admiration, and desire. "You're relentless," he murmured later, as we watched the sun rise together. "And you," I replied softly, "are finally learning that you can't gamble with someone who plays by her own rules." By the end of the weekend, the dynamics between us had irrevocably shifted. Victor was no longer the dominant force he had once been. I had taken the lead, not through manipulation, money, or social status, but through presence, intelligence, and the refusal to be underestimated. The storm had passed outside, but inside, a new storm brewed, one of tension, attraction, rivalry, and the dangerous thrill of two forces of equal strength colliding. Victor and I were now locked in a battle that neither could predict, and the stakes were higher than ever. I realized then the truth: this was no longer a bet, a game, or a challenge. It was a revolution, one that would not end until both of us had fully confronted our power, pride, and desires. And I was ready for every consequence, because Victor had chosen a bet, and I was about to show him that I was a fire that could not be contained. The weeks after the mountain retreat became a delicate dance of power, intellect, and unspoken desire. Victor's attempts to control me had intensified, but so had my resolve. Every move he made, every calculated gesture, was met with a counter I had crafted carefully. He had chosen me as a bet, a gamble meant to amuse him, but he was slowly realizing that he had underestimated the storm he had unleashed. Victor invited me to a private charity auction, one of the most exclusive events in the city. The mansion was a labyrinth of opulence, filled with influential figures, glittering chandeliers, and whispered power plays. He assumed that the public setting would remind me of my place, that the world's gaze would compel me to submit to his dominance. I entered with confidence, letting the whispers follow me, letting every glance affirm that I was no longer a mere accessory. Victor's expression flickered with surprise and something deeper, admiration mingled with frustration. "You're impossible," he whispered when our eyes met across the room. "I prefer unstoppable," I replied, letting a hint of a smile linger. The auction began, and Victor tried to assert control, guiding conversations, positioning me strategically. But I had prepared. Every auction item became a stage for subtle influence. I impressed owners with knowledge, charm, and insight, shifting attention from him to me in ways he could not stop. By the end of the evening, murmurs of respect and awe spread among the elite, while Victor's carefully constructed control was quietly unraveling. Later, alone on a balcony overlooking the city skyline, the tension between us crackled like electricity. Victor's voice was low, almost vulnerable. "You've changed the rules entirely," he admitted. "I thought I could predict you. I was wrong. And you will be wrong again," I said softly, "because I don't follow your rules. I create my own." For the first time, Victor hesitated. He was no longer a man in control, but a man confronting the reality that he could not dominate me, not with money, charm, or influence. He was intrigued, frustrated, and undeniably drawn to me, and I, in turn, was aware of the dangerous thrill that came from standing as his equal, unafraid, unbroken, unstoppable. The tension escalated further over the next days. Victor began sending subtle challenges, invitations meant to test my limits, dinners, private meetings, and luxurious trips. Each was a battlefield, each a test of patience, strategy, and composure. I met every challenge with intelligence, wit, and poise, further eroding his assumption that he could control the game. Then came the storm of revelation, a secret from Victor's past surfaced, one that threatened to destabilize his carefully curated image. A rival tried to leverage it to humiliate him in the media. I saw an opportunity, not to manipulate him, but to demonstrate my strategic brilliance. I acted swiftly, discreetly coordinating with allies in his circle to neutralize the threat. By the time Victor realized what had happened, the danger was gone, and the city's elite were none the wiser. He looked at me then with an intensity I had never seen before, admiration, awe, and a hint of something deeper, a recognition that I was not just a woman in his life, but a force he could not predict or contain. That night, as the city lights shimmered below, Victor finally admitted something he had never voiced. "I thought I could control you. I thought this was a bet, but I was wrong." "I never was a bet," I replied. "I'm a storm you chose to face, and now you'll see what it means to be challenged." For the first time, the lines between game, strategy, and desire blurred. Victor was no longer the dominant figure he once believed himself to be. I had taken the lead, not with charm or wealth, but with presence, intelligence, and unshakable self-assurance. And yet, despite the tension and the unspoken attraction, a new question emerged: could he accept being challenged, respected, and even tamed in a way he had never experienced? Or would pride and ego force a reckoning neither of us were prepared for? The game had reached its edge, a precipice of power, desire, and danger. And standing there, with the city sparkling below and the storm of emotion between us, I realized one undeniable truth: Victor had chosen a bet. But I was the fire that could not be contained, and he would either rise with it or be consumed by it. This was no longer a game of social maneuvering. It was a battle of hearts, minds, and wills, and the outcome would determine not just who controlled the narrative, but who would ultimately dominate the realm of desire, power, and respect. And I intended to win, fully, utterly, and without compromise. The tension between Victor and me had reached a dangerous, electrifying level. Every encounter now carried weight, a silent duel of minds, strategy, and unspoken desire. He had tried to control me, charm me, and dominate every room, but each attempt only revealed the truth: he had chosen the wrong woman to underestimate. It began with a private invitation to his estate for an art unveiling. The mansion, perched on a cliff overlooking the sea, was drenched in moonlight and anticipation. Victor assumed his influence would intimidate me, that the grandeur would make me yield. But I had learned long ago that confidence is the true measure of power, not wealth or social status. As we entered the gallery, the tension between us was palpable. Victor tried his usual tactics, subtle provocations, charming smiles, and controlled gestures, but I was prepared. I engaged with the artists, impressed the collectors with insight, and subtly redirected attention from him. Every move he made to dominate the room was countered by my own presence, my intellect, and my confidence. By the end of the evening, murmurs spread. Victor's bet had become the center of attention. He watched me, conflicted, frustrated, and undeniably drawn. Later, on the balcony overlooking the sea, the air thick with salt and tension, Victor finally dropped his guard. "You're impossible," he admitted, his voice low, almost vulnerable. And yet, I replied softly, "You can't look away." The vulnerability in his gaze was a crack in his armor, one that I had never seen before. For the first time, he was not in control. I had become an equal, and the dynamic shifted irrevocably. What had started as a bet had evolved into a game neither of us could predict, one fueled by intellect, power, and a dangerous, undeniable attraction. The following weeks were a whirlwind of escalating encounters. Victor sent challenges disguised as invitations, trying to test my limits, provoke me, and draw me into his world of high stakes. Each time, I responded with strategy, wit, and control. I was no longer just a participant, I was shaping the narrative, turning his tactics into opportunities for my own advancement. One night, during a storm that mirrored the turmoil between us, Victor confronted me directly. The city below was lit with flashes of lightning, the thunder resonating through the mansion like an echo of our tension. "You think you can outmaneuver me," he said, voice low and dangerous. "But this is more than a game." "I know," I replied, stepping closer. "This is real, and if you want to play, you'll need to understand that I don't follow rules that aren't mine." His eyes darkened, a mix of frustration, desire, and respect. "I've never met anyone like you," he admitted. "I don't know if I want to win or lose, or surrender." I smiled faintly, feeling the pull between us, the collision of strategy, desire, and power. "Then maybe stop trying to control me," I said softly, "and learn what it means to meet someone who can challenge everything you thought you knew." The storm raged outside, and inside, the fire between us ignited. The line between rivalry and attraction blurred. Every glance, every word, every touch became a battlefield and a temptation. Victor had underestimated me, and in doing so, had unleashed a force he could neither predict nor contain. Over the next days, the tension escalated further. Victor and I were drawn into high-stakes business negotiations, social events, and private encounters that tested patience, strategy, and restraint. He tried to dominate, to charm, to provoke. I countered with intelligence, confidence, and calculated presence. And then came the turning point, a private dinner on the terrace overlooking the stormy sea. The wind whipped around us, carrying the scent of rain and salt. Victor reached out, a subtle gesture, his eyes searching mine. "You've changed everything," he said, voice trembling with the weight of unspoken emotions. "I didn't choose this. I didn't plan for this." "No one can plan for this," I replied softly, "because this isn't about plans. It's about choices. And I've chosen to be unstoppable." For the first time, Victor saw the truth. He had not won a bet, controlled a game, or tamed a challenge. He had met a storm, a woman who commanded respect, intellect, and desire in equal measure. That night, as the storm outside raged on, we both understood a dangerous truth: neither of us could walk away unchanged. The fire between us was too intense, too consuming, and too real. What had begun as a wager had transformed into a collision of power, pride, and passion, a storm that could either destroy or ignite us completely. Victor had chosen a bet. I had become the storm, and nothing would ever be the same. The days after the stormy night on Victor's terrace were electric. Neither of us spoke directly about the tension between us, yet every encounter carried it, a silent battle of wills, attraction, and intellect. He was learning, slowly but undeniably, that I was not a gamble he could predict, nor a prize he could claim with money, charm, or manipulation. Victor's attempts to regain control became increasingly sophisticated. Private meetings, high-stakes dinners, and luxurious outings were his playground, and I navigated them with calculated grace. I allowed him to believe he was leading the game, while subtly maneuvering the events to highlight my intelligence, independence, and command. Then came a scandal, a calculated attack from one of Victor's rivals, designed to humiliate him publicly and compromise his reputation. He assumed I would panic, hesitate, or fail to act, but I had anticipated this. I mobilized discreet allies, coordinated solutions, and subtly redirected attention, neutralizing the threat before Victor even realized the danger had existed. He watched me in stunned silence afterward. "You saved me," he admitted, voice low, almost awed. And I had no idea you even cared to. I smiled faintly. I didn't save you because I care, I said softly. I did it because I refuse to be underestimated, and I play to win. For the first time, Victor realized that I was not a passive player in his world. I was a force, a storm he could not control, and a challenge that ignited a fire in him he hadn't felt in years. Pride, desire, and respect collided within him, creating tension so palpable it almost became unbearable. The following week, Victor invited me to a secluded villa overlooking a crystal-clear lake, far from the eyes of the world. He assumed isolation would give him an advantage, that away from public scrutiny, he could assert dominance. But I arrived prepared, confident, and unafraid. The evening began with subtle challenges, intellectual debates, strategic games, and quiet provocations. Each of his attempts to unsettle me was met with calm, wit, and precision. By the time the night deepened, the tension between us had escalated to something almost unbearable, a mixture of rivalry, respect, and undeniable attraction. Then, in the quiet of the villa's terrace under a sky full of stars, Victor admitted his feelings in a whisper that shook the air between us. "I don't know if I want to control this, or be controlled," he murmured. I stepped closer, the distance charged with unspoken promises and danger. "Then stop thinking about control," I said softly. "This isn't about winning or losing. It's about meeting someone who can challenge you and maybe even change you." That night, the dynamic between us shifted completely. We were no longer a game of bet and challenge, we were two storms colliding, unpredictable and unstoppable. Every glance, every word, every subtle movement became a battlefield and a temptation, a push and pull of power and desire. Victor tried to maintain his composure, but the cracks were visible. He was drawn to me in ways he couldn't explain, challenged by my presence, frustrated by my independence, and simultaneously intrigued by the fire I carried. And I, in turn, understood the dangerous allure of his intensity. Victor Larivee had underestimated me from the start, but now he faced the reality that I could not be tamed, predicted, or controlled. I was a storm, powerful, relentless, and unafraid, and he had chosen to step into it. The climax of our battle was inevitable. A high-profile gala awaited us, the most exclusive event of the season. Every interaction, every conversation, every public glance would carry consequences. Victor believed he could use the event to regain control, but I had other plans. I would not only navigate the world he ruled, I would command it, subtly, strategically, with intelligence, charm, and confidence. The stakes had never been higher. Pride, desire, and strategy intertwined, creating a tension that threatened to ignite at any moment. And I knew, deep in my bones, that by the end of the night, everything would change. Victor had chosen a bet. I had become the storm. And soon, the world would witness the fire that neither of us could contain. The night of the gala arrived like a symphony of tension, anticipation, and unspoken desire. The city glittered below, a sea of lights reflecting the grandeur and power of a world Victor Larivee had mastered. He expected control, that his wealth, charm, and status would dictate the evening. But he had long underestimated me. I was no longer the bet, no longer the accessory, no longer the predictable participant in his world. I had become a storm, unstoppable, intelligent, and unafraid. The moment we entered the ballroom, all eyes turned. Victor's usual confident smirk faltered slightly as whispers spread. The woman he had chosen as a wager, the one he assumed he could mold and manipulate, now commanded attention, respect, and admiration. Every subtle glance, every poised movement, every confident smile announced that I was here on my own terms. Victor leaned toward me, voice low but charged with tension. "You've changed everything," he admitted. "I didn't think it was possible." "I didn't come to change your world," I replied softly. "I came to change mine, and it seems to have affected yours too." The gala unfolded like a battlefield. Victor attempted to regain his dominance through subtle gestures, carefully curated interactions, and whispered influence. I countered at every turn, engaging with influential figures, guiding conversations with intelligence and charm, and exposing vulnerabilities in those who assumed they were untouchable. By the end of the night, the murmurs were unanimous. Victor Larivee's bet had become the master of the room. Later, on the balcony overlooking the sparkling city below, Victor finally confronted the truth he had been resisting. "You're unstoppable," he admitted, a mix of awe, frustration, and desire in his eyes. "I've never met anyone like you. I don't know if I want to fight this, or surrender to it." I stepped closer, the tension between us thick, almost tangible. "Then stop trying to dominate me," I said softly. "Learn what it means to meet someone who can challenge everything you thought you knew and maybe, just maybe, teach you a new kind of respect." The air was electric. Pride, desire, and power collided, neither of us willing to retreat. Victor, for the first time, was confronted by a force he could not manipulate, charm, or buy. And I, for the first time, realized that the man who had once been my opponent could become the one who matched my intensity in every way. Days turned into nights of subtle tests, mutual challenges, and quiet revelations. Victor tried to assert control in the boardroom, at social events, and in private moments, but every attempt only reinforced the truth. I was no longer a wager. I was the architect of my own power, commanding attention, respect, and desire in equal measure. Then came the ultimate test, a private negotiation that could either destroy Victor's reputation or solidify his empire. He assumed his influence would dominate, that his experience would outweigh mine. But I had anticipated every move, calculated every potential outcome, and leveraged every subtle weakness. By the end of the negotiation, the outcome was undeniable. Not only had I secured victory, but I had done so with grace, intelligence, and authority that left everyone, including Victor, in awe. He looked at me afterward, the usual arrogance replaced with something raw and honest. You've won, he said quietly, almost reverently. I never needed to win you, I replied, smiling. I needed to win myself. And it seems I've won both. That night, in the quiet of the city's skyline, the tension between us transformed. The game, the bet, the rivalry, all of it had culminated in something neither of us could deny: respect, attraction, and a connection forged in fire and intellect. Victor, the man who had once underestimated me, now saw me not as a challenge, but as his equal, a storm he could admire, desire, and respect. The storm that had begun the day he chose me as a bet had not only survived, it had conquered. I had navigated power, charm, social scrutiny, and desire with precision, turning every obstacle into an opportunity and every underestimate into fuel for my rise. Victor reached for my hand, a gesture of surrender, respect, and acknowledgement. I don't know if this is victory or surrender, he said softly, but I know one thing: I've never met anyone like you. And you never will again, I replied, my voice firm, confident, and unyielding. Because I am the storm, and storms cannot be contained, only respected. We stood there, overlooking the city, the culmination of weeks, months, and challenges behind us. The fire between us burned not from control or dominance, but from mutual recognition, two forces, equal in power, intellect, and desire, finally acknowledging each other. Victor had chosen a bet. I had become the storm. And the world, for the first time, saw that power, strategy, and self-respect could not only command attention, they could change the rules entirely. The night ended not with victory or defeat, but with balance. The game was over, yet the connection remained, electric, undeniable, and alive. I had proven what no one else had believed possible: underestimation was my weapon, independence my armor, and self-confidence my greatest ally. Victor Larrivee had gambled, and in doing so, he had unleashed a force he could neither predict nor contain. And I, the woman he had once chosen as a bet, had rewritten the rules, won the game, and claimed a power far greater than money, influence, or social status. Because storms are not tamed, storms are respected, and I was a storm that would never be forgotten.